Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where you are invited into the hearts and stories of those who have committed their careers to the protection and preservation of our great national parks. Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, highlighting all that goes into managing our national parks and building a sense of appreciation for the invaluable beauty, diversity, and history of our protected lands. Today, we get to hear the story of Sholly, the Yellowstone National Park Superintendent. Yellowstone is the world's first national park and leading what many refer to as America's best idea. For those who don't know about Yellowstone, it spans Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, and is known for its geothermal wonders, astonishing wildlife, and awe-inspiring wilderness. Cam himself has been superintendent of Yellowstone since 2018 and has an impressive background both inside and outside the National Park Service. Today, we'll get to dive into his career and also get a behind-the-scenes look at the challenges and joys and future-looking goals at his current position at one of the most renowned national parks. Cam, welcome to Who Runs This Park. It's a joy to have you here today.
Thanks, Maddie. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course.
Good to see you.
One way I like to start the show and kind of start off conversations is just sharing one of the more unique situations you've had working in the National Park Service, and then from there, we'll dig into a little bit of your story and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, I think probably one of the most unique was dealing with the historic floods that we had here in Yellowstone last year. That was, I've been in a lot of assignments across the country over the last 30 plus years. And that one sits probably at the top as far as challenges and seeing so many people come together for, to get the park back online and support these economies and support employees and partners and things like that. So that was a terrific effort by a lot of people and probably is sitting at the top. And it happened in the 150th anniversary year of Yellowstone as well.
Man.
So that's a big one. There's multiple others, but that's probably the top challenge that I've faced in the Park Service.
Yeah, and I know you and I briefly talked about this before we started recording, but for, people listening to the podcast, hearing about Cam's position specifically is actually what encouraged me to start this podcast. And it was actually last summer when it was like right after the floods had happened. And the context is some of our family friends are your, I guess, brother and sister-in-law, correct?
Right.
And I'm like, all the different connections. I'm like, I have to make sure I'm saying the right wording. But our brother and sister-in-law of Cam, and I think the timing, we were having dinner with them was right after the floods, and they were talking about everything that you had to do. I remember hearing, there's only, I believe, 4 entrances into Yellowstone, and 2 of those, or there's 5, but then how many are accessible in the winter? Only
2. Well, yeah, we go to an over snow for 3 of the entrances in the winter, and then the 2 entrances in the north are accessible by vehicles.
Yeah, and I remember learning about that and just like how you're having to manage that and prepare for the winter season, but then also dealing with like all the people trying to come to the park. And then also because it's a park, you want to restore things in a sustainable way, and learning about all these intricacies. It, for me, was the first time I had learned about the superintendency role, and then learning about all the intricacies that you had to deal with. I was floored and like literally couldn't stop talking about it all night. And my family was like, I don't know, it's just a job. And I was like, no, you don't understand. This is so cool. So yeah, I'd love to. I saw within 20 days, you're actually able to reopen 93% of the park. So I'd love to hear how you went about that, kind of how you assessed the damage and got all the troops ready to respond in sustainable, but also like fast ways.
I think for some context, just like around the country, we just come off of 2 relatively tough years with COVID, and a lot of these economies that surround the park that rely on tourism were heavily impacted by that. So we work very closely with the 3 states and the 5 counties and the multiple communities from Jackson Hole to Cody to West Yellowstone to Gardner to Cook City that surround the park. About 96% of the parks in Wyoming, 3% in Montana, 1% in Idaho. About 70% of the visitors, though, come through the Montana entrances. And so we get somewhere about around 4 million visitors a year, a little more this year. And, visitors spend close to $1 billion, $1.5 billion in communities within 50 miles of the park, Grand Teton and Yellowstone. So tourism is and a huge economic driver. And we get somewhere between 75 and 80% of our visitation in the summer months. And so to have the flood occur overnight on the night of June 12th into the morning of June 13th, and to have such catastrophic damage, and to have a mindset shift in communities of, hey, we're about to have a great summer, to no access in at least 2 of the 5 entrances was, a big shock.
Yeah.
And it was really important that we, assessed properly, made some really tough decisions in that recovery period, and got the park, 50% of the park reopened in 8 days, and over 93% opened in 20 days. And then the major road corridors that were blown out in the north were rebuilt in less than 4 months. So it's, and that was a true team effort, not just here in the park, but with our external partners.
Yeah. That, especially with that context of kind of, I grew up in Austin, so summer starts in like March, but in places like that, like June is like, it's still pretty chilly, probably the slower part of the season. And so
June's busy. June's not August and July, but it's getting busy.
It's ramping up.
We get close, a million people a month in July, and close to that in August. And June and September are, 700,000-800,000 people a month.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So it's not the busiest, but it's getting busy. We probably had somewhere between 10 and 12,000 people in the park that evening. They too woke up to, whether they were at a campground or in a hotel, to a large weather system that had wreaked serious havoc on a lot of our facilities and roads and bridges and things like that. And so I think one of the biggest success stories there was the team of our maintenance workers and law enforcement staff were out in the middle of the night dealing with rock slides and mudslides and things that before the roads blew out, and actually closed those roads proactively to public travel, which unquestionably saved lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Had they not done that, there's a good likelihood that we would have had people just driving off roads into 80 feet into raging rivers.
Oh my gosh.
That was, I think, something that was a real positive. We did not have a loss of life or major injury. And,
that's really great.
That was due to the actions of those team members that took it upon themselves to take those proactive measures.
And so were the roads that were proactively closed, were they ones that management knows that they're prone to flooding?
No. This park is not historically, I think the last kind of major flood that we had was 1997. And for reference, for people that know the Yellowstone River, the last major flood event was 97. I think the cubic feet per second, so the water volume traveling down the river corridor, was somewhere around 31,000 cubic feet per second. In this flood in last year, the CFS was almost 52,000.
Oh, wow. So close to double, actually.
Well, 20,000 CFS increase from the last record flood. So and it never been recorded that high ever.
What were some of the first actions? I'm assuming getting people out of the park maybe was a first step, or kind of how in those first, 48 hours did you start mobilizing?
Well, we mobilized immediately.
Right.
What was difficult initially is we lost power. We had, not the greatest amount of information right away on the extent of the damage, because the floodwaters were still occurring. So there was still a lot of damage that was happening into that morning. We knew we'd closed the northern part of the park. We started to get the reports and some of the pictures from some of the flood damage in the road corridors. And these are the corridors: the north entrance, which is between Gardner, Montana and Mammoth, here where headquarters is, and then the northeast corridor, which is out toward Lamar Valley to Cook City, Silvergate, Montana. So once we started getting those reports and seeing some of the pictures, realizing those roads were clearly heavily damaged, we made a decision to evacuate the northern end of the park. And if people have been here that are listening, it's the road system's kind of a figure eight. There's a northern loop and there's a southern loop. Mm-hmm. And we decided to push all the visitors that were up north to the south, because obviously they couldn't get out the 2 road corridors. And so we could do better damage assessments and make sure that everybody was safe and that kind of thing. Later into that day, we decided to go ahead and evacuate and close the entire park. So we evacuated, I think, 10 or 12,000 people in about 24 hours. We had, we operate about 8 water systems in the park. This Mammoth here, which is where we have major hotel operations and headquarters and residence for employees. We ran our wastewater through in a pipe that went under the road to Gardner's system. So that pipe was severed in 5 locations when the road collapsed. So we were somewhere around 250,000 gallons of wastewater were pouring into the Gardner River that morning. And so, it was a lot. So it was accounting for employees, making sure employees are safe. It was accounting for visitors, making sure they're safe. It was evacuating the park. I was working with Northwestern Energy to get the power restored. It was using our teams to figure out how to divert that 250,000 gallons of wastewater that was pouring into the river. Those were kind of our primary initial priorities. We executed those very well. The wastewater was diverted within, I think, 30 hours. The power was back on in 40 hours. We had very good damage assessments from the air that day, the 13th, with our helicopter. We were able to start immediately communicating with the communities about how they were doing, and then started setting very specific short-term and long-term objectives for, damage assessments around the park, how fast could certain damaged areas get repaired. And so that was basically the first 48 to 60 hours or so.
Yeah. So how do you divert waste? Is it like trying to catch the broken? I've just never thought of that. Like trying to catch, I guess, the severed areas and set up new pipes, or?
No, we were, this might be the only time you hear me say that I was glad that there was some 1930s infrastructure that hadn't been removed. But we had, back in the 30s, the way that they dealt with wastewater, and obviously this is prior to a lot of the environmental legislation that we have in place now, is the wastewater went into a trench and into these ponds called percolator ponds. And that's how they treated wastewater here between 1930s and early 1960s.
Okay.
Until more modern plants were built, and that trench and those ponds had never been taken out. So we were able to go back and retrench the trench and divert the wastewater into the trench into the old 1930s ponds, and that got us through last summer and the winter while we built a $40 million wastewater system here in Mammoth, which was put online last summer.
Okay, nice. And that, I guess, is rewiring some of the piping that got damaged in the floods?
All the piping down to Gardner is still blown out, so that's not usable. When we decide on where our permanent road is going to go, we'll look at options to rerun the pipe back down to Gardner.
I see.
Right now, we'll use the plant that we built here over the last year. We realized pretty quickly that the southern loop had been impacted less than the northern loop. And one thing I'll back up on, just for people that are wondering how this set up in the first place, is we got more snow in April and May that year than we did in January, February, and March. And so when you get that kind of late snow, it doesn't really have time to set up a snowpack. Whereas a normal year, you have, a solidified snowpack, and you have gradually warming temperatures, and it melts the snow slowly through the spring. We had so much late snow that when we had a major rainstorm that came in and dropped 4 to 5 inches of rain, melted that 4 to 5 inches of snow. And so within about 48 hours, somewhere between 8 and 10 inches of water came roaring down the mountains into the rivers. And that's how the flood happened, for people that are curious. But we were able to repair most of the southern loop. We had Federal Highways engineers and others in the park very quickly to assess damage. We got this. We figured out that we could get the southern loop open relatively quickly. We get 1 million people per month in the park. You can't put 1 million people per month into half the park's road mileage.
No.
So we worked with the communities every day to try to determine how to best reopen slowly or gradually and not overwhelm the southern loop. We built a reservation system in 3 days.
Wow. With partnership of recreation.gov, or?
Yep, rec.gov helped us, and then a lot of our visitor use folks in the park and regional office in Denver. We socialized that reservation system with the gateway communities. They did not want it. They were mostly the hotel owners, Airbnb, VRBO owners were afraid that people trying to get a reservation on the new system wouldn't be able to get reservations that matched their accommodations on the reservations they already had, and they thought there'd be mass cancellations. So I basically threw out a question to the gateway communities and the business owners about, hey, okay, if you don't want the reservation system, what do you want?
Yeah.
And a suggestion from a hotel owner in West Yellowstone was that we use a model that was used back in 1976 for gas rationing, where the last digit of your license plate was odd. You could get gas on odd days of the calendar. If it was even, you could get gas on even days of the calendar. And he said, why don't you use that as an entry process? So if it's an odd day of the year and you have an odd license plate, you can get in the park. If it's even and that should cut traffic in half,
Right.
theoretically. And I thought that was kind of a crazy idea initially, and then realized, you know what, it actually might be brilliant, and socialized that concept with Jackson Hole and Cody and West Yellowstone, and they liked it. And so so the flood happened July 13th. I think on June 13th. On June 22nd, we implemented what we call the alternating license plate system on the southern loop of Yellowstone. It was incredibly successful, simple, predictable, and didn't require a bunch of online reservations,
scrambling and
things like that. So, we did get some calls from some of our rental car partners who asked us to stop that system initially, because apparently people were calling up and demanding a guarantee that they could get an odd or even license plate. And the rental car company was like, well, we're not set up for that. We don't do it that way. It worked really well for 8 days. Then we got the northern loop opened. So we dropped that license plate system, and we had, somewhere just over 93% of the park opened at around July 2nd, I believe. So,
wow.
Yeah, good team effort there. And then we got to work very quickly on rebuilding these road corridors with our federal highways partners. We had great support out of Washington and Congress and the states, and got great contractors on the 2 corridors, and they were able to rebuild. We built a new road here between here and Gardner, and then they repaired the road between here and Cook City by the end of October of 2022.
Yeah, that's definitely, it's a bummer that it was such a drastic flood, but a very unique experience, and just kind of seeing things come together and people really trying to, like you said, be very dedicated in reopening the park and problem solving and quick action.
Yeah, we ended up, we're normally at 4.2 million visitors per year. We were able to salvage last summer to the best degree possible, and we ended up with 3.2 million. So it was a million short of normal, but it was much better than had the park been closed all summer.
Yeah, absolutely. Had it been closed, you probably would have had 1 million visitors, if even, for the whole year.
Yeah.
And who knows? Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm curious of jumping back a little bit, actually, talking about that was a much more recent thing. But I know also in researching and preparing, I actually learned that you're a 3rd generation park service manager, which one of my favorite things of doing these podcasts is understanding and learning about everyone's different path into the park service and their path to becoming a superintendent. And, it's totally varied. It's some people who the superintendency and joining the park service was later in their career. Some people started out right after college or before that. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience growing up in and around the National Park Service, and what those, I think it was both your dad and your grandfather were in the Park Service.
Yeah, after World War II, my grandfather got out of the Army and started working for the National Park Service, became the chief ranger of Big Bend National Park in the late 40s, and then was chief ranger at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, and then superintendent of Badlands National Park in South Dakota in the mid to late 50s. And so my father followed in his footsteps, started as a seasonal firefighter for the Park Service in 1964, and worked in many different capacities. Ultimately became the chief ranger of Yellowstone, which is one of the division leads here. And, I was fortunate to be able to grow up in parks like Yosemite and Crater Lake National Park and Hawaii volcanoes, and finished my high school. I went to, multiple high schools, but finished high school actually here in Yellowstone and Gardner, Montana. So had that kind of legacy experience in being connected to national parks and the importance of national parks to our country. And I think it's one of the more noble missions in the world.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
And I think it's great. I went in the military after high school and got out of the military and started working here in a backcountry seasonal maintenance position.
Oh, what was it?
In Thoroughfare.
Yeah, I was reading that. Thoroughfare. There was something I was really interesting. It's the most remote.
It's one of the most remote areas in the lower 48.
Yeah, the farthest place from any roads, right?
Yeah. So I lived down there in the summer of 1990, 91. And then from there, that's a fantastic place. I've been back 5 times.
Something that I found interesting when researching Yellowstone more, and I've been to Yellowstone, I think when I was in middle school or early high school, maybe my family flew into Salt Lake City and then drove to the Tetons, Jackson Hole, and then Yellowstone. But what I learned is most of the visitors only see, I'm not going to get the percentages right, so I'll rely on you for this, but it's so many of the visitors don't see a huge percentage of the park, but how there's all these like you said, 4 million visitors, but then probably the visitors to that area that you managed is 2% of that, maybe? I mean,
oh no, it's not even close to that. So the park is 2.2 million acres. For reference, that's bigger than Rhode Island and Delaware put together. Less than 2,000 acres are pavement, and somewhere above 95% of the visitors never get more than a half mile away from their car. So the majority of our visitation is in a very, very small percentage of the park. And, I've been back to Thoroughfare 5 times since I've been superintendent. It's a special place to me. And several of those trips, you're seeing, you're talking about going 70, 80 miles round trip, maybe less than 10 people you see.
Wow.
And, no noticeable difference or increase in numbers of people seen back there now than 32 years ago when I worked back there in the trips that I've made. So, there's a narrative out there that the parks are being overrun by visitors. There are obviously areas in the park that are very congested, like Old Faithful and Midway Geyser Basin and the Canyon Rims. And those are things we've got to manage. We can talk about that. But overall, the ecosystem health-wise is in better condition now than when Yellowstone became a park 150 years ago, 151 years ago. So it's important for us to focus on visitation and how to manage it appropriately and what the impacts of visitation are. But people need to remember that impact is in a very small percentage of the park. And Yellowstone is the only place on the face of the planet that has this level of wildlife and visitor interface. You can go to Africa maybe or Alaska and see more wildlife, but no people.
Right.
You can go to plenty of places and see more people, but no wildlife. This is one of the very few places in the world where you have so much wildlife and so many visitors interfacing, and that's got to be managed very carefully as well.
What was your experience at Thoroughfare? I think what I had read was you were doing trail maintenance mainly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So were you out like all summer? Were you backpacking typically, or what does the trail maintenance process look like?
We had a base camp. We slept in tents.
Okay.
We had a kind of a central camp that we used, and then we would hike to different work sites, from our base camp every day.
Okay. And was that being your first? I think you did this, if I'm remembering correctly, after you were in the military, correct?
Right.
So did you, because you had been living in Yellowstone before going into the military and when you were in high school, were you drawn to go back, or is it more just like where you found a role?
I really had a great connection with Yellowstone when I came here in high school. Dad was still here.
Oh, nice.
So I came back from the military, and, it was kind of a natural progression to try it out. I wasn't sure if I was going to do the Park Service as a career at that point. I had no intention of being the superintendent of Yellowstone or anything at that point. It was a great way to start off in a post military career.
Yeah. After having that summer experience, I guess, at what point did you make the decision to more intentionally be like, I actually do want to pursue a longer career within the Park Service?
So in the Park Service, we've got different disciplines, resources, facilities, maintenance, education, interpretation, law enforcement, visitor resource protection. So I came up through the visitor resource protection rank and went to Yosemite as a backcountry ranger in 1992, and then moved into a variety of different jobs there over the next couple of years, and kind of at that point realized it's something that I was interested in doing longer term.
For those first couple of years, I've learned that a lot of times folks start out as seasonal workers, and then you probably have to have a couple seasons under your belt to then transition into that full-time role. So I'm assuming that was a similar experience for you, of those first couple summers in Yosemite were as a seasonal worker, I'm assuming this summer, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the seasonal workforce in the National Park Service is essential, since most of our parks have seasonal visitation spikes.
Right.
In fact, most of our Western parks, the majority of the visitation, as I said earlier, usually come between May and September-ish, and the seasonal workforce is critical to the operations of the National Park Service. And so it's a great way to introduce people to the Park Service, to see if that's something they're interested in. And then we normally pick most of our permanent employees from the seasonal ranks.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's a good way for people to try out and see if it's something they like.
Yeah, for sure.
Park Service obviously needs the extra help in certain times of year, and it's a great pathway to permanent employment in the Park Service.
Yeah, something I've read about, not just at Yellowstone, but actually at a lot of parks, is that housing seems to be a hard issue for like housing seasonal or even permanent park employees. And I know it's been talked about at Yellowstone also, but what I was curious about is you've had experience across, being regional director and then working at other parks. So I'm curious if you feel like any parks have a really good handle on that. And if you want to, are there any parks that you want to almost mimic or use as an example for implementing at Yellowstone?
We're setting the standard right now in housing improvement for the entire country.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Tell me about that. That sounds awesome.
Yeah. So we have somewhere around 500 housing units in the park.
Inside actual park boundaries? Okay.
And we need to house somewhere between 800 and 1,000 people per year. We've got a couple different goals in our strategy. Number one is we had, of that 500 units, we had somewhere around 65 to 70 trailers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that were in horrible condition that we were housing, primarily seasonals.
Okay.
And some of the worst housing that I've seen in my career. And so we, with the support of Washington, we're able to secure funds and we just finished this summer replacing all trailers with new housing units, brand new.
Are they being replaced as trailers or being rebuilt as? No,
they're high quality modular houses.
Oh, cool.
So they're not. We didn't replace trailers with trailers. We replaced trailers with housing. And we went out to the employees in 2018, 19 when I first got here and said, what do you want in housing? Right. And they wanted basic things. They wanted their own bathroom.
Right.
They wanted their own washer dryer. They wanted a bigger porch or whatever the case is. And so when we started looking at, we have a very short build season here because of the heavy winters that we have. So it can take a really long time to build normal stick build houses. We started exploring the modular housing market, which has come a really long way in the last 10 years. I'm a huge proponent.
What does that mean?
So it's basically we design houses to our specs with a company that gets under contract with the federal government, and a modular housing company, in this case, the one we've been using is in Redwood Falls, Minnesota. They manufacture the houses to our specs in a controlled environment indoors. Okay. And then they truck those houses in halves out to our locations and then put them together.
Okay.
And stitch them together. And that's the model that we've used the last 3 or 4 years to get the trailers replaced. So we've got excellent progress moving on that front. We've rehabilitated somewhere around another 200 non-trailer houses. So replacing 1980s appliances and carpet and roofs and siding and, insulation and things like that. Through the Great American Outdoors Act, we've been very fortunate on a variety of different fronts, but we received a significant amount of money to restore some of the historic houses that we have here in Yellowstone.
Oh, cool.
And then the biggest challenge that we face, and not just here in Yellowstone, but around the Park Service, is any major park that's got expensive gateway communities where there are either limited houses available for sale, too expensive.
Yeah.
Or rentals have turned into Airbnbs and VRBOs that can, employees can no longer come into those communities and buy or rent. Right. Need a place to live. So we'll be actually looking at expanding the number of houses that we have in the park to accommodate and offset some of the major changes that we've seen in local housing markets.
So across the country, it's putting some of those housing systems within the park boundaries because of the gateway communities becoming more expensive.
Well, Grand Teton's another great example of a park. Jackson Hole is one of the most expensive communities in the country. And if you're trying to attract a workforce to run and manage the park and the park's programs, you have to have a place for them to live. And they're not going to be able to afford some place in Jackson Hole. And, that's, if you look at Gardner, Montana, even we have somewhere around 100 employees that have houses in Gardner that is right 5 miles here from headquarters. It's outside the park. A lot of these employees bought their houses in the late 90s, early 2000s when it was very affordable.
Right.
Housing market's gone through the roof. In one case, one of our plumbing supervisors who just retired, very important job, by the way, bought a house for $175,000 in 1999 on the Yellowstone River and just got offered multiple millions of dollars for it. So good for Claude.
Yeah,
good
great
for Claude
return.
that he got, but not good for when we try to replace Claude. So Claude's replacement can't afford Claude's house, and but we need that job filled. Where does that person live? And so far, the best solution is for us to actually add some inventory above and beyond what we had in the past into the parks and housing portfolio.
Cool. Yeah. I can see that aside from the small percentage of roles where, like your first experience at Yellowstone where you were camping all summer, that's not the norm.
Yeah. That's not the norm. And there's different set of expectations now than 30 years ago.
I know some of the other roles that you had leading up into the superintendency at Yellowstone was, I think this was in DC, you were the Associate Director for Visitor and Resource Protection, correct?
That's right.
I learned that you helped implement a national employee safety strategy. So I was curious about what that entailed, because obviously it's a very noble thing for those who aren't familiar. My understanding, and obviously Cam, you'll have more context, but that this was able to dramatically reduce employee fatalities across the Bureau.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a team effort. It wasn't just me, but it was primarily driven by, at that point, 10, 20 years of us having a substantial number of employee fatalities in a variety of different disciplines.
Right.
Maintenance workers, volunteers, law enforcement officers, whatever the case is. And I was a superintendent of a parkway called the Natchez Trace Parkway, which is in Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. And it's 450 miles, a couple hundred employees on that parkway. And what I realized is there was no real guidebook for how superintendents should set up safety programs in their park units. Kind of like every superintendent would try to do the best job that they could, but there was really there's no way of kind of baselining how someone was doing in certain areas and make that consistent across, well over 400 units of the national park system. And so the effort that we made in Washington was to try to provide a more consistent way to measure, put the right safety tools and mechanisms in place and measure success, and then use a lot of both private sector and public sector proven practices in safety to try to incorporate those better into the National Park Service safety program.
Right.
And, we have been successful in many areas of especially lowering the numbers of fatalities across the system. But, we've got a long way to go there, just like most organizations do.
Yeah. I was talking to Suzanne, who's the superintendent of Lake Clark up in Alaska, and she was sharing that for that park in particular, like the only way in and out, you can take a boat to some areas, but it's like mainly by plane. And sometimes people will, just based on the weather, like you plan to go for a day, but the plane can't land because of a variety of weather conditions for several days. And so it's like, there is an inherent danger just with a lot of these places because of the remoteness and the wilderness and all of these things. And so, building out a system and, like you said, continuing to improve it to continue to make those conditions safer is really valuable, because there are just a lot of, I forget where, or I was learning about, I've gotten into backcountry skiing recently, and the big thing with that is there are inherent risks in doing it. So it's all about managing the risks. It's like you can't not have the risks be there, but you have to manage them in a way that does produce, safety to the extent that you can.
Yeah. And we, back in the 07, 09, 10, we adopted a Coast Guard model referred to as operational leadership, which really works to empower employees with risk-based decision-making and, puts more of hopefully an onus on mitigating risk, understanding when the risk is too great for whatever you're doing, and making the appropriate decisions to either not do it or to mitigate it. And that's a challenge when you've got a mission like ours, so many diverse parks. You've got a very committed workforce. It's very mission driven, and trying to, instill a concept of you don't have to do everything. It's okay to say no sometimes, or there's different ways to do things that can be a hard culture to change. But operational leadership's really, I think, has helped us significantly in at least understanding where risk exists and having a more open and honest conversation about what we need to be doing to protect employees better.
Yeah, I forget who I was talking to this about. It probably was Suzanne, but in terms of like changing the culture of the employees and the National Park Service, it's also empowering visitors who are going out into the backcountry and empowering them to make those decisions also with a risk mindset, because it's not very, at least right now, like our culture is not very, or it's very achievement driven. And, so it's like, I want to do this loop, or I want to get to the top of this mountain. And, if the conditions, like the weather, things that are out of our control that are stronger than us as humans, and we are like powerless in those situations, sometimes the right decision is to be like, you know what, like we're actually not going to summit today because it's not safe. And so I think that culture can be really dangerous even for visitors.
Exactly. Yeah, we have a lot of visitor fatalities in the Park Service also every year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's true.
How do you think the agency is addressing? I know there's a lot of resources, like when I've gone into the backcountry and like all the resources and reading and preparing, but are there similar like strategies that the Park Service is employing to try to increase that knowledge for visitors?
Well, first and foremost, what I'd say is that the biggest onus is on the user. There is personal responsibility involved in any moderate to high risk thing you're going to do, and even low risk. But what I see and what I've seen over my career is a lot of complacency when these accidents happen. A lot of times in the highest risk areas like climbing El Capitan in Yosemite, we've had fatalities on El Cap, proportional to the number of climbers that climb it. They know that a mistake will cause you your life potentially. So there's more preparation. There's obviously the significant skill set that's required to even embark on that.
Yeah, a skill set I do not have.
Climbing Mount Rainier or, those types of things. So then you get into, the father and the son that gets in the canoe and it's nice and sunny and calm on Yellowstone Lake. And an hour later, there's 4-foot swell, waves, and they weren't ready, or, those are, or people that go out in the backcountry conditions in deep Yellowstone and don't understand what they're getting themselves into, or the importance of bear safety or anything like that. And so we do our best to ensure that people using the backcountry understand the risk, ways to mitigate the risk. But ultimately, that's a responsibility that people have to take very seriously. And as we've seen in many, many cases, if they don't, it can cost them their lives.
Yeah, my sister and I, and this is like a personal example of it was humbling because we were in Mount Rainier and, it ended up being totally fine, which I think can be the danger sometimes if you're like, oh, we got away with it, it's fine. But it was eye-opening in a more gentle sense, but there was wildfire smoke from the Cascades. And, we were just on a short backpacking trip, but it was a big eye-opener because we were like, how would we actually know if we needed to evacuate? Like, we don't have an evacuation plan. Like, how it was just so much of the time, especially right now, we rely on our phones and we rely on all these things. And it's, when you go into the backcountry, you need a plan of how you're going to contact people and communicating, like when you're supposed to return and all those things. But it was, for me, a really good reminder. And thankfully, like, there was no damage in that moment, but it's like even more clear of like, I have to have a very clear communication plan. And just, it was like another, like the fire safety aspect wasn't something I had actually thought of before. And so, yeah, it's a lot to think about. And part of it is exciting to be educated in these areas and feel confident and risk manage, but it's a lot that you have to kind of be on top of just to even go for like a 2-day trip.
Yeah. And you've got to have a workforce that's skilled and capable enough to rescue these people. And bad things happen, and that happens a lot throughout the year. That gets into our ability to recruit and retain good talent and operate these parks at an effective level to deal with pretty much any type of situation that comes our way.
Yeah. I know another part of your history before being at Yellowstone was as Midwest Regional Director, and I saw that over that time period you hired over 30 superintendents. So I would love to hear what that process was typically like. And was it, is that a normal amount of superintendents in that time frame that you served as regional director, or was there, just a higher spike of?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix. There's a lot of vacancies at that when I assumed the job. There was also a lot of people that retired, and so it just happened that there was a significant number of vacancies. And Midwest is a great region. I'd worked a lot in the Pacific West region, Intermountain, Southeast region, Washington, but I'd never really paid too much attention to the parks in the Midwest until I was regional director there. And I think it's got some of the best and most diverse parks in the system. All the parks, 61 parks from the Dakotas to Ohio, Canada to Arkansas, St. Louis Arch to Isle Royal to Badlands to Hot Springs to Cuyahoga Valley. So it's a really, really great region. And, some of those areas aren't that well known in the system. So hiring superintendents into places that people haven't really heard of, or a lot of remote assignments also in that region, can be challenging, but we hired some fantastic superintendents that still to this day are doing a great job in many parks in the Midwest.
Yeah, that's also been something, it's a goal of this podcast, but it's also been something I've learned of. I mean, like you said, obviously before starting this podcast, I knew of Yellowstone, I knew of Yosemite, I knew of the big names, and I think they get a lot of attention for good reason. I mean, they're beautiful places, kind of that jaw-dropping, awe-inspiring beauty. But I've been like, I just feel really lucky and fortunate to have learned also more about each of these other parks that maybe I didn't, I'd heard of, but didn't know where it was or didn't know much about it. And just the diversity of all the park sites and the value that they all bring. So it's been really fun to talk to the big players, the high visible names like Yellowstone, and also maybe some parks that don't have as much recognition in the Park Service.
Yeah.
Moving into Yellowstone specifically, so I know you've been there since 2018 and we've talked about it in a couple different lights, but it seems like there's been a lot of decisions surrounding different species populations and the management regarding, whether that's bison or wolves, or I've read of different fish populations. Do you feel like those decisions have been more common or unique to being at Yellowstone, or are these things that you dealt with at other sites within the Park Service?
Well, I think its aspects are similar to other sites. Probably not the total wide range of species management that we have here in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And, I tell the story regularly, but it's important for people to understand that Yellowstone became a park in 1872, before the states of Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho were even states.
Oh, wow.
And you think about not a single member of Congress that voted for the Yellowstone Park Act in 1872 had ever stepped foot in this place. And you're talking about 7 years after the Civil War, and Ulysses S. Grant is the president. There was no such thing really or there's no conversations around conservation or ecosystem protections or climate change, or any of these things that we talk about regularly today. Thinking about the miracle that it was that, this area was set aside primarily on expedition reports and paintings that were done here and then taken back to Washington. It's pretty incredible. I'll talk about some American Indian viewpoints on that later, but because it's not all positive.
Right.
In the eyes of the American Indian nations. But I think that you look at first several years, and this is right in the middle of, pretty significant westward expansion, the amount of poaching and the amount of damage being done to the park for that from 1872 to about 1876 was very substantial, to the point where the U.S. Cavalry was brought in to protect the park in 1886. And
was that the Buffalo Soldiers?
No, I mean, those are more like Sequoia, Yosemite.
Okay.
There were some Buffalo Soldiers, but the 1886 to 1916 was basically the park was managed by the Army, and then it was handed back over to civilian control in 1918. But we screwed up things really badly. We killed every predator. And that was the government policy for the most part. So we extirpated the wolves. We killed thousands and thousands of bison to the point where, there was less than 25 animals in the park.
Wow.
Killed grizzlies, mountain lions, you name it. We had very significant negative impacts on this place. And, you fast forward to the 1960s, we're feeding grizzly bears out of the garbage dumps and literally letting people line up in their cars at garbage dumps and feed bears out of their cars. And that's only 55 years ago.
Wow,
so it's not that long.
Yeah.
And so when I say that the ecosystem's in better condition now than it has been since Yellowstone's become a park, is because of a lot of hard work that's happened in the last 50 years, especially. We kind of started getting serious in the late 60s, early 70s about environmental legislation, National Environmental Policy Act, or the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, or Endangered Species Act, and started recognizing a lot of our previous actions had taken their toll on the health of these ecosystems, and we needed to do better. And so the superintendent in the mid-90s, early 90s, mid to mid-90s, two different superintendents really focused heavily on restoring wolves to Yellowstone, which is probably the singular most successful wildlife restoration effort in the history of America. And, there are people that will argue that point, obviously, but I firmly believe that it brought the ecosystem back into balance in many, many ways. We had an ungulate population that was out of control, that was having significant impacts on other species. We had very low grizzly numbers.
Did the wolves help increase the bison and grizzly numbers?
No. So the wolves reduced, for instance, we'll take elk. when there's not predators on the landscape, ungulates grow disproportionately. There's nothing to control population naturally. That's why you have hunting seasons in different states for, deer and elk and other species. Those populations have to be managed and controlled. In Yellowstone, it's mostly a natural management process. You've got to have the right predator prey balance on the landscape. Without wolves, the elk population just in northern Yellowstone probably exceeded over 20,000 elk. And when you have that many elk in an area, all they're doing is basically eating every cottonwood, willow, the landscape of northern Yellowstone was no aspens, destroying and destabilizing riverbanks, a huge number of peripheral impacts because of that. When you put wolves back into place, those elk are now on the run on a regular basis. Not too long after the restoration, that elk population dropped from over 20,000 to probably about 7,500 to 8,000, which is a much more balanced number.
Yeah.
And because of that, also the willows came back, the cottonwoods came back, aspens came back, beavers are back. There are a lot of species that rely on the right balance of species in the ecosystem. The grizzly bears obviously put on the endangered species list. That's been very successful. And, we've gone from probably 200 grizzlies back in the, 80s and 90s to over 1,000 in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So a lot of good success stories there. And, bison continue to be a challenge to manage. About 60% of the bison carry a disease called brucellosis, which can induce abortions in cattle under the right conditions.
Is that the chronic wasting disease, or is that a different?
No, that's a different disease.
Okay.
We work closely with the state of Montana and USDA and others when bison migrate out of the park to figure out how to manage that population as effectively as possible. And it's a lot of different opinions on how that should look. Same with wolves and other species. And then we're doing a significant amount of fish restoration, native fish restoration across the park. We just did a big event the other night on white bark pine, which is probably one of the less known but keystone species in the ecosystem that are becoming, where climate change is significantly impacting their populations. Mountain pine beetle, a disease called fungus called blister rust, which kills the trees. And working with other agencies and partners like the American Forest, USDA and the Forest Service to try to come up with a strategy to improve how we're managing white bark pine and regenerating white bark pine. So I think overall it's been a huge success story, but there's a long way to go to not. We've got a massive amount of terrestrial invasive species continuing to come into the park that we need to be very cognizant of and have the right strategies to address. A new introduction of aquatic invasive species that can be very threatening to natives, things like that. What
are the most common ways that, I guess, both these terrestrial and then aquatic species are introduced into the environment?
Well, people have heard of a quagga mussel. That's
on the boats, right?
That has very significant impacts. This year, one of our aquatic invasive species inspection teams detected quagga mussels on a boat that was about to launch into Yellowstone Lake.
Wow.
Before it launched. And then this team was so good that they denied the launch. They called down to Grand Teton and warned them this guy might try to launch down there. And sure enough, he tried to launch on Jackson Lake. So that's a really big problem or potential problem with having motorized, especially inboard motors.
And is it just that these mussels or these species are in a different body of water and the species settle on
they just have
the boat?
So if you've got a native ecosystem, that ecosystem's been constructed to rely on basically the native species within the ecosystem.
Right.
So when you start introducing things like lake trout, which we have a major problem with in Yellowstone Lake, and we've been spending $2 million a year for the last 10 years to eradicate lake trout, because lake trout kill cutthroat trout, which are native, which grizzlies and ospreys and many other species rely on.
Right.
And, so the biggest issue with the non-native species is they normally have substantially negative impacts on the native species, whether it's aquatic or terrestrial. And that's probably one of the single biggest challenges we'll face in the future.
Do you think in Yellowstone or just across all national parks?
Across the country, around the world in many ways.
Yeah. It's cool to hear that reintroducing the wolves and then the other work that you've been doing since then in Yellowstone has had really positive impacts.
Yeah, it's been big. It's a team effort. We're all here for a short amount of time. And try to do the best that you can. And the next superintendent and the next team continues hopefully to carry on and protect the progress that's been made.
And like you said, people feeding grizzly bears out of garbage cans was like 50 years ago. So hopefully the education and knowledge will continue of like how to better be stewards of our environment.
Yeah, exactly.
So you had mentioned, there's the history of Yellowstone being established as a first national park, but there is that other side of the story with Native Americans. And I would love to hear some of the different ways that you're managing those relationships with like Native tribal communities around Yellowstone.
Well, we have 27 affiliated American Indian tribes, so tribes that have a cultural, historical connection to Yellowstone in one way or another. And, we've historically had good relationships with tribes.
Right.
And they had partnered on things over many decades. We used the 150th as a point in time last year to really try to improve our engagement with American Indian tribes and really build stronger relationships. And that led to a great initiative we started last year, and we did it again this year. It'll probably become a permanent initiative, which is the establishment of a tribal heritage center at Old Faithful.
Oh, cool.
And so that center, I think last year had 30 different tribal scholars and artists that rotate in different weeks of the summer, and they engaged, thousands and thousands of visitors directly. National Park Service has a important role in telling America's history, the good, bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
No one can tell the story of the tribes like the tribes can. So it's been, this year we had actually, I think 38. So we had even more tribal scholars and artists at center. And, I think that's really important. And we're going to continue to build on that momentum. We had numerous other tribal events in the park over the summer with different tribes, engaging directly with visitors. We've got this bison conservation transfer program where I didn't mention earlier, but we capture bison. We test them for multiple years for the disease brucellosis. If they're deemed disease free, then we move bison to our partner tribes at Fort Peck, the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes. That's been very successful. We just doubled the capacity of that program.
Why do they have to be tested over several years? Is the disease really hard to detect?
Well, they can actually test negative initially, and then they can test positive within a certain amount of time. So just because you have a negative test initially doesn't mean that they couldn't test positive. So there's a protocol that we follow that as a USDA protocol, and after a certain number of tests in a certain amount of time, there's almost no risk. They're deemed disease-free, then they can be transferred out of the park. So we've shipped around 300 bison to, I think, 23 tribes in 12 states.
Wow.
Since 2019. And then we just put $1 million into doubling that capacity. So we'll be able to do that even more moving forward.
And how are you identifying bison are they like, if they leave the Yellowstone boundary, you'll test them?
They migrate every year down to the boundary, and we'll capture whatever number that we need to fill the program.
I know you were mentioning some of the other initiatives.
We've got some great work going with tribal colleges and setting up tribal internships. And I think the biggest thing is really having substantive conversations about how we can partner. And I think that we'll continue to gain momentum in that area and develop these relationships even more into the future.
Yeah. It sounds like, in that area, you're looking forward to some of the future initiatives, but are there any other projects on the horizon with Yellowstone that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, I've got 5 priorities that we're focused on primarily. So one we call focus on the core, which is the workforce. So within that priority, we focus on housing improvements, which I already mentioned what we're doing there.
Yeah.
We're focused heavily on mental health and wellness and providing, everybody's been through a lot. This place can be a grinder, providing the right level of services to our workforce is really important. Our second priority we've talked about extensively today is strengthening the Yellowstone ecosystem. So, a lot of geologic, natural, cultural resources, where the resources that are most vulnerable to impacts, how do we continue to protect the progress that we've made and make additional progress in the future. Our third priority is delivering a world-class visitor experience. So how we manage visitation, what amenities are available, those types of things, public safety, you name it. The fourth is investing in infrastructure. And we have hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure projects going right now for new bridges and roads and trails and boardwalks and wastewater and water systems, things like that. And then the fifth is building coalitions and partnerships. So that runs from tribes to members of Congress to communities and counties and states and nonprofits, not just here in and around Yellowstone, but across America and even globally.
Yeah. Keeps you busy, I suppose. A lot going on. Yeah.
Yep. And I just passed my 5-year mark here. So,
wow.
We'll see what happens, but everybody, like I said, everybody's here for a certain amount of time. You try to do the best job that you can in the time that you're in these places. And then at some point, it'll be time for someone else to take over.
Yeah. Appreciate your time and just sharing a little bit about your time at Yellowstone and then kind of what led you to that place. A way that I like to end interviews is just asking, what is something that you wish everyone knew about Yellowstone, regardless if they have or haven't been? And I know Yellowstone's a very well-known park, so that might be a little bit harder to answer.
Yeah, I don't think there's any one thing. I mean, I think if you ask 100 people that love Yellowstone, why they love Yellowstone, you'll get some similar answers in those 100 responses, but everybody's got a favorite thing. So we might want to go and look at birds. Some people want to go fish in 5 different places. Some people want to go watch wolves for 3 days straight. Some people want to go geyser gaze in Old Faithful and Norris Geyser Basin or whatever the case is. So there's not really a single thing. I think I'm very pleased that the backcountry isn't busy. But the backcountry of Yellowstone is the real park. And for people that I think get the opportunity to get actually away from the roads and out into Yellowstone's backcountry are treated to something pretty special and kind of a vignette of primitive America in many ways when they're able to do that. But that's not an advocation for people to start going out in the backcountry necessarily. But it's a great park and it represents some of the very best of America, and we're lucky to have it. Yeah.
Thanks for all that you do to steward it and continue to protect it and keep it as like a gem of our country and of the world, honestly.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Maddie. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Cam.
Appreciate you doing these series. It's important.
Thanks so much for listening today. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. If you liked this podcast, rate, review, download, and tell your friends about it. This ensures the stories of our national parks and how they are run are shared. Listen to the other episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts or visit us at whorunsThisPark.com to learn more. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.